Good afternoon, everyone. I am Orly Burlov from PreVeil, and we are here today to have a very important conversation on the CMMC documentation challenge. Today joining me, I have my colleague, Noel Vestal from PreVeil, and one of my new favorite acquaintances and friends, Ryan Bonner from DEFCERT. Thank you guys for joining me in this very important conversation. I'm great to have you. Just so everyone knows, we are recording this webinar, and we'll be sending out a link to the conversation later tomorrow so that everyone can follow it again. So this honest conversation about CMMC might seem perfectly timed or a bit late, but in either way, it is something that must be talked about because the documentation around CMMC is truly a challenge to many defense contractors out there, as well as the MSPs that support them. I think it's important to know why we're having this conversation, and it's in order to truly help the defense industrial base get to the bottom of how they can make this process easier. We're going to start today's conversation by first having Noel and Ryan introduce themselves. And then I would like, Noel, for you to take it from there and pick it up by saying why documentation matters.
Definitely. Ryan, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. So if we haven't had a chance to be in the same digital event together, my name is Ryan Bonner. I'm the CEO of DEFCERT. We're a compliance consulting firm, and I'll kick it over to you, Noel.
Thank you. I'm Noel Vestal. I'm the compliance manager here at PreVeil. And I think one of the most important things about documentation, aside from the fact that every auditor is going to be looking at your documentation extremely closely, is that it's very cost-effective way. It's probably the most cost-effective way to make your audit easier and significantly less painful in the long run. But Ryan, I know you have some examples of some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so there are a lot of people at this point who have been through CMMC provisional assessor training and things like that. One of the things that you will be taught is that you need to use certain methods of assessment in order to gather documented findings or evidence or whatever we're going to end up calling it when the CMMC assessment process comes out. So if you want to think about that for a minute, someone already has to document something for all 320 assessment objectives in CMMC 2.0. That person is the assessor, but in any case, they're going to be writing things down. And so when we look at the fact that it takes more time to go through an interview to get what you need to write down, and it takes certainly more time to go through a staged demonstration or some sort of test procedure in order to get what you need to write down. The most effective posture I can imagine for my assessor is an assessor basically typing and doing this. Their document says this, my document says this, back and forth and back and forth. That's got to be one of the most time-effective and cost-effective ways to enable an assessor to get the findings they need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love what you said, you want to be able to have the assessor just look and say, okay, these are the boxes I need to check. Oh, boxes are checked. Okay, great. You want to have that one-to-one sort of scenario going on. It's going to make it so much easier. But I know that there's such a challenge to documentation, and so many people see it as a challenge because to get to that point where it is easier is so much work behind it. So that's it's kind of the catch-22 tricky part of it. Yeah, it's going to make the assessment so much easier and faster. And like you said, it's so much simpler to have somebody go, okay, I see box one. Okay, I see box one, I'm done. Versus, like you said, an interview or having to do tests of some kind. But the issue behind it, of course, is how is that documentation going to be created? Like, what do you see as the biggest challenge on that?
That's a good point. I think, Orly, you and I were talking about that a couple of weeks ago, trying to figure out what is sort of the best way to sort of get the ball rolling to start making some strides there. I don't know if I think that you were kind of talking about from your background on the product side, like what is our minimum viable product, if you will.
Right. And so, on that point, I think that's a good place to kind of just a good springboard on which to really begin this conversation today. What how do you get started with that minimum viable product? We all like to think of things in terms of startups terms. The minimum viable product for your documentation, what does that look like? Where do we go?
Yeah, I think when I'm looking at an organization who might not have an overall documentation strategy, I want to get them going on something that's directly connected to like the key components of their program, which is people and processes and technology. So we're looking for some sort of like foothold in those topical areas from a documentation perspective. So Noel, I know that you and I kind of talked about like what would be a good initial document in kind of like each of those key areas. So I think you had some ideas for the people side.
Yeah, definitely. I think the people side is probably, I mean, for me, that's one of those easy ones where it's, you make an org chart. I mean, I know that seems like such a simple and base thing, but really and truly, that is the foundation of your organization. Who is responsible for what? What is the hierarchy? What are the different people and what positions and roles do they have? I mean, if you don't have that sort of baseline, it's going to be really difficult for you to understand the rest of the documentation and who applies to what, in my opinion. And the same kind of thing with when you're talking about processes and procedures and policies too. I mean, you want to make sure that, all those people who are in that org chart, you understand which processes apply to who, how those processes apply to everyone in the company if they do, how those policies, actually apply to everybody as well. I think that those are baseline sort of understandings of, okay, if I'm going to have a process, who's going to do it? Who's going to be responsible for it? Who is it going to apply to? And also and then of course, what control is it going to apply to? And the same thing with policy, who's going to be the one who enacts all of this change. So I think that sometimes we inadvertently separate process policy from people, when I think we need to definitely remember to integrate who's going to be controlling all this stuff and managing all of it. And like the technology side, I know you have a lot to say about the technology side.
Yeah, well, just to kind of build off of what you were saying, I mean, if you've got that org chart and you've at least got a roster of individuals you can select from who could be tasked as being the process owner or being that first role or name or department on the top of that document you're building for process, now it's a lot easier to work through the responsibilities and things like that. When we get into the technology assets that are involved in a CMMC implementation, really where I want to start is if I can get one, an asset inventory, hardware and software. That's hard to find in an organization who's just getting started. So if you back me into a corner and we have to start somewhere, I'm going to look for a network diagram. And that network diagram might be very, very high level, but it's something that lets me get inside the head of the people who are doing the technology implementations to really understand how they see value, how they see interdependencies, and what some of the most important technical components are in their environment. At least we've got a jumping off point now to have some of these next order conversations.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I'm glad you brought up asset inventory, because I know that's what we were talking about earlier about what kind of examples do we have of some common documentation for the different domains. And I think you have some stuff with that.
And so I know you guys work to create a couple of examples of some common documentation. And so why don't I just bring up those slides and we can go through them one by one. Give me just 1 second to pull up the slides.
Sure thing.
While you're pulling those up, I think our goal for this when we first had a conversation is just let's create one possible example for each of the different families that are within the model. So then at least we've got something to point to and say, hey, if you were going to try your hand at one type of documentation in each family, what could that be? What could that look like? So again, not a comprehensive list. We can't possibly go through all the possible kinds of documentation that need to exist. But if we were just to pick one and talk about what's different about that from one family to the next, what would that look like? So
you kick it off, Ryan.
Okay. I was going to say, fire away. I don't remember exactly what our order was here, but for access control, there are a lot of organizations who start sort of at the very first practice in the model, and they start writing access authorizations, and that's okay. But what are some of the other things that we could think about? And the ability to just assign responsibilities, I think, is an important document or artifact to create. We talked before about how if we've got an org chart, we at least know who's eligible to be responsible. But one of the top level design principles that goes into our implementation is separation of duties, right? So, if I've got a way to sort of matrix out, here's a responsibility that should be kept separate from that one. So let's get those assigned out to different individuals in our list, or different teams or departments, depending on how big the team is that's doing the overall work. That could be huge. And then starting to build out some sort of rudimentary responsibility matrix for who's going to, tackle that issue primarily, who's going to support that. That you might call that a RACI chart, you might call that a PASI chart, whatever allows you to sort of show how people are going to be involved with each other in performing that work. I think that's valuable too.
All right. Should we go to the next one?
Might as well.
All right. Let me just switch here.
Oh, and I'll take
Why
this.
don't you jump in on this one?
Oh, you want to jump in? Okay.
No. Why don't you jump in?
No, I said
I know that when I'm in the presence of greatness, why don't you go on ahead?
Yes, Ryan is the presence of greatness for sure. Awareness and training is a really important one, and there's so many different things. There's a lot. I mean, there's so many different items that you have to address with awareness and training, but the big ones, and you see it here, there's role-based training. If you have a security administrator, they need to actually have security administration related training. If you have, there's security awareness, which is kind of across the board for everybody in your company. And so is insider threat. Those are the big ones. So this is just a very rudimentary example of a training log. This can be done, a multitude of different ways in a Google Doc or on a SharePoint list or in an Excel file, or however, makes the most sense for your business. But the information you want to definitely include is the name of the training, when it was given, the employees that took the training, obviously, who administered it, and the frequency of it. Is it quarterly? Is it annually? Is this something that happens when people are hired? Is it something that happens when people leave? There's also having to, debrief people when they go as well. That can be kind of considered training as well. So there's a lot of different moving parts with awareness and training to think about. And then you also want to think about what types of training you want to do. Is it going to be sort of an asynchronous situation where you record something and send it out? Are you going to use an outside company or a vendor to do that training? Or are you going to do it internally with a tabletop exercise or something like that? There's a lot of different ways to do that, and making sure that you have that documented as well so that an auditor can see it is imperative.
Just a quick question to clarify for the audience, Noel. So this training documentation is not just for you, it is for the auditor. The auditor could say, hey, Noel, I see that you're employee number 2 here. Tell me when you had this training, and what was the topics that you discussed, and what do you know about that topic?
Absolutely. Yeah. An auditor absolutely could ask that in an interview question, certainly. So yeah, it's important to make sure that, because it's awareness and training, right? It's not just training, it's being aware of what you actually got trained on. That's really the key part.
It's a compound noun. Make sure you notice that and sign.
Yes, the awareness part is part, I think, that sometimes kind of goes by the wayside. I know we're all guilty of it, where we've done a training once a year and we just kind of forget about it, and it's fine. When those auditors come in, they absolutely orally can ask those questions. Hey, this training you took on X date, about insider threat, give me an overview of it, explain it to me. And if you don't remember it, that's not going to look good.
Yeah,
I think there's something really important that we should point out here, which is just one of the core concepts of documentation overall. If I'm an assessor and I don't have the document yet, like what we have here, I'm going to interview you to find out how you track these things. And then I'm going to ask for the document. You're going to give it to me. In reverse, if I've already provided this document to the assessor, right, before they show up for their on-site, we're doing it in reverse. So they already have the document, and then they're talking to me about it. Well, what's the advantage there? I know what document I gave them. So I can review this document before they talk to me and increase my awareness of what was written down that I gave them before they start talking about it. That seems like a better position to be in from an assessment perspective. And
I think you just summed up why documentation is so important just in one sentence, because you know what you're getting yourself into significantly more than, like you said, if it's like, oh, I don't have a document, you guys can just come talk to me about whatever it is you feel like. Yeah, you're not going to have that preparedness. That's such a good point.
Absolutely.
All right. We could talk a lot more about this, but why don't we go on to the next one? Because I'm finding these really interesting, and I'm sure the audience is as well.
So here we've got audit and accountability. So in this case, this is one of the things that I think a lot of organizations haven't gotten started on yet. And that's because there are significant technology investments in collecting logs and things like that for most organizations. So when we have that, sometimes we're holding off on getting the documentation part started before, before we actually get going on the technology side of things. So in the audit and accountability family, we have a requirement to identify all the auditable events we want to be represented in logs. So even before we start shipping those logs, we can maybe have a discussion on which ones we want to generate in the first place. And the best way to do that is to spec those out in a document. So in this case, I think we've just got some Windows event IDs for a Windows machine and the nature of the event, a description of it, things like that. That's going to be really critical for, I think it's 3.3.3, where you actually do a review to make sure you're collecting all the events you do want to collect, and that maybe you can get rid of some that are high signal to noise ratio or not useful or clogging up, your retention policy. So those are some of the things that if we have that written down, that kicks off the ability to make decisions about them. So
Let me just jump in with a quick question here. It seems to me that it might be unclear to someone whether an event should be audited or not. Do you have any insights on whether an event, how companies can make that kind of bifurcation of, yeah, this is something we should keep or something we should not?
I think it just comes down to a matter of how useful that logged event is. Is that particular event showing you something about the network that's useful in the investigation or analysis or response to, unauthorized activity in the system? If that's not true, then the question becomes, do I need it? And if the event is more troublesome than the value it presents, so it's creating a lot of false positives, or there's just a lot of these events generating that don't allow you to see the forest for the trees, then it might not be useful to continue collecting.
All right. Let's go on to the next one, because we want to go through all of these and just want to kind of stay so that we have some opportunity for people to jump in with questions on the end. Why don't we go to this next one?
Oh, this is a good one. Baseline configuration and asset inventory. So we talked about asset inventory earlier a little bit and hit on that, but baseline configuration is one that I think some people struggle with, since it's not like necessarily a familiar term to a lot of people. But essentially all it is, hey, what is on your machine? What is the standard image for your machine? In this case, you see here, we've got Windows 11 and it's got Microsoft Office on it. If there are additional applications that are going to be outside of that baseline configuration, that needs to be tracked somewhere. You need to make sure that you understand which assets do have, outside of the baseline configuration for whatever reason. So the idea being that if you know what's on all of these machines, then it's a lot easier to make, to track them and to do those updates and do those patches as necessary and what have you. It just makes it a lot easier across the board to manage security when you know that everybody's on the same image.
Right. All right. When we try this next one, Ryan, password policy. That's obviously an important one that people are going to need to perhaps think a fair amount about. What can you add here?
Well, I think that this is a target-rich environment. Just one password policy covers so many assessment objectives that you really want to have this written down in such a way that that it matches reality. You don't want any nonconformity here. So coming up with a password policy that is generally achievable across a big chunk of your system components, or maybe even all of them, is going to be valuable for your organization, because then it's true everywhere. So regardless of where the assessor spins the wheel and says, show me how you did it over here or over here, that you're going to be in a good spot. So it's okay if some of your systems go above or beyond the complexity requirements or the character requirements or whatever it might be. I think it's more important that the baseline that you set as the floor for that is generally best practice and matches modern security for your systems and things like that. So that would be maybe a good way to explain a situation where your policy might be more of a guardrail or a minimum, and it's okay to go above and beyond it.
Right. All right. Noel, why don't you help us with this next one on an incident response plan? I know you and I have talked a lot about how this is often one of the most complicated and time I hate to use this word, but it's the biggest time suck that many companies will face in terms of their development.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this really is, you know, such a huge part of security. I mean, because incidents unfortunately will happen at some point, you know, and you want to minimize them as much as possible. It's the whole idea behind CMMC and NIST and so many different frameworks, but incidents are going to happen. So what is the handling of those incidents? You know, who are the people that are notified? How are they notified? What are your communications? You know, where do those communications live? How do you document that information? How do you document your lessons learned? You know, do you have an after action report? Do you have a conversation with all of the stakeholders after the incident happens? You know, there's so many different pieces and parts. So, I mean, it looks so simple here where you're saying, oh, incident handling and reporting and testing, easy. And it's definitely misleading because it's not only how you handle the incident or how you report it, but then also the testing as well. So are you having tabletop exercises quarterly with all of the people who were involved with, you know, the pre-identified possible incidents you want to talk about? Or are you having an in-person training with everybody? Are you having a combination of both? You know, again, it goes back to, if you don't have that stuff documented, it's going to be much more difficult to have a conversation with the auditor and be able to prove that you really are checking those 3 very large boxes under incident response.
Yeah, and this is one that takes a large amount of time, but is super important both to the company and to the auditor.
Absolutely, yeah, and to the security of CUI. I mean, quite frankly, so it's a very, very important piece. And again, it's very misleading that it's, you know, it doesn't look like it's that much, but really there's so much involved in those different sections.
All right, Ryan, why don't we talk about maintenance schedules?
Sure. So maintenance is part of an overall system life cycle, right? And so if we think about our physical facilities, when we have a visitor or someone who comes in, you know, we log that they showed up and their name and for what purpose they're here, things like that. We want to sort of adopt the same posture for maintenance, right? We want to know why we activated a privileged account and went to make system changes. Was it a planned change? Was it an unplanned change? Is it just simply preventative? What's the nature, so that we can show that to the assessor in the future? So you know, a lot of organizations, this kind of detail would be captured in like their managed service provider's ticketing system or something like that. So it would just be good to know that these things are taking place and that you've got an overall record for it. So this need not be an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. It could just as easily be a report of ticketed tasks that were performed throughout the month or whatever it might be. Something that you can grab easily and get in front of an assessor to show them that you are managing that life cycle and that we are doing things like scheduling patches and updates, or doing flaw remediation or fixing a misconfiguration, whatever it might be.
And if I can just jump in, it seems like the important part here is that you have some sort of schedule maintenance, right? That it isn't ad hoc.
Yeah, even if you're just doing a biannual firmware update or something like that for a system that's relatively stable and boring, that can be valuable. It's also good just to go in and collect certain information from systems to make sure that there's no you know, non-conformities you weren't aware of. This is really tied deeply into the configuration management aspects and the flaw remediation aspects of the model. It's just kind of a functional part of it.
All right, let's jump on to the next one. Media sanitation records.
Good one.
What can you tell us about sanitation, Noel?
So there's a lot of different types of media that might have to be sanitized. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are moving digital for quite a bit of, excuse me, of their business.
Just clarify what you mean by sanitize, so it's clear what everyone.
Yes. So sanitizing means either completely destroying something that had some kind of CUI on it, or wiping it in some way, shape, or form so that you can reuse that media for different business process needs. So this is an excellent example, very basic media sanitation record. You want to know what type of media it was. You see some examples there. This is physical media in this case. You know, whatever kind of asset inventory, again, this connects back to asset inventory. So if you know, any of these items you see here on media should be listed on your asset inventory. So then, you know, you can go back to your asset inventory and say, oh, well, you know, CD1 has been destroyed. Now I need to go ahead and update my asset inventory as well. Encryption status, whether or not CUI is present on it, you want to make sure that you actually apply the policy and procedure that you have for sanitation to those items. So that's a really big one. Whatever you have documented as your policy and your procedure for addressing that sanitation for CDs or for USBs or what have you, that needs to be captured here as well. I did, X, whatever it was, based on the procedures we have here, to make sure that everything sort of connects back. So again, so an auditor can look at it, see, okay, this is what your procedure says, and this is where you're actually doing that.
All right. Personnel screening records, Ryan. What can you tell us here?
This is one of those situations where the overall screening requirements for CMMC are very light, in the sense that they just want you to screen personnel before you grant access to CUI. Now, when we go into organizations who handle export control information, their rules are very different. They need to confirm US citizenship or personhood status, and sometimes that's the high watermark for the nature of their check. Organizations might also have other things they look for. They might, go through a criminal background check and things like that. So whatever those parameters are for the check, we just need to confirm that those were done. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of organizations change to start routing new account creation requests through HR. So instead of going to the IT person and saying, so-and-so starts on Monday, the IT person says, that's great. As soon as HR tells me that we've got a successful background check, I'm cleared to create that account. So having that noted is really important, because this pulls double duty. It's part of our process for authorizing access back in the access control family. So having this written down, I think, is critical, so that when you do it in reverse and also offboard individuals, you've got proof of that disposition for that user account.
All right, running through these. Visitor logs. Sounds kind of like it should be trivial, but it's not.
Oh, it's not. And it's funny you say that. I don't know how many different companies overlook this. It's because of exactly what you said. But it's like, oh, well, it's trivial. I mean, like, why would I have to do that? If I have an office that, if I have one office, right? If I'm this tiny little office and it's just one door that people come into, I shouldn't have to worry about visitor logs.
Right.
Well, you absolutely do. So whenever somebody comes in who is visiting your facility for whatever the reason, this is the type of information you want to make sure that you capture and keep those logs somewhere. It can be digital, it can be physical, it doesn't matter, but you definitely need to keep a log of who's visiting, why they're visiting, the date, and definitely make sure they are escorted. Make sure there's some sort, what kind of areas of access are they actually going to see? Are they going to have access to CUI in any way? That's a huge one. So keeping track of that stuff is very important. And again, making sure that it connects back to the procedures you've already written regarding physical security.
All right. Vulnerability scanning reports. You want to tee this one up, Ryan? Under
Sure.
risk assessment?
Really, these reports are most valuable when they show an assessor or your internal organization when a vulnerability was first identified, what date, and then when it's no longer seen on the network. So vulnerability scan shows this vulnerability, it has this CVSS score or rating, it's critical, high, whatever. And if we got internal benchmarks for flaw remediation, 3.14.1, that's going to drive how quickly we want to get these taken care of. And so that's also going to be a key input for our plans of action that we develop for identified vulnerabilities, which is sort of the language of 3.12.2. So this is just really a critical input, and also a measure of performance for continuous monitoring. So it's really helping out or informing other processes elsewhere in the model.
Yeah, and just really quickly, can you give an example of what might be a vulnerability raised by a risk assessment?
Usually it has to do with something regarding like either the way that the system is set up. So because you have this setting enabled, someone can actually use that and we know that they can exploit that. Or it's going to be something that has to do with the underlying firmware or operating system. Hey, there's a flaw in this system that can only be fixed if you update or patch it. So that's what's going to prompt you to get on top of your maintenance activities and patching and updates from that perspective. So targeting the updates that fix the most critical vulnerabilities, ideally in the most critical assets.
All right. The next one is one of my favorites. Plan of action and milestones. So this is, up there with incident response in terms of its importance. This is a very significant part of any path to compliance. Why don't you kick us off here, Noel, and talk about POAMs?
Definitely. Oh gosh, yes. So many poems. You and I have talked about this a lot, Worley. So Yeah, plan of action and milestone or a POAM is very much what it sounds like. What is your plan to address these different items of security where you may be lacking? So if you have, excuse me, you know, POAM item number 1, that might be one of your controls. Maybe you're having issues. In this case, we use the example of MFA. I mean, that's a big one. It's all over the NIST and CMMC universe. So how are you going to actually deal with that? Who is the POC who's going to be in charge of dealing with that? When did you plan to start it? When did you plan to finish it? And then when did you actually start it? And when did you actually finish it? Because as we all know, those things can shift very easily. And then making sure that you have milestones. A couple of the milestones in this case are, you know, well, we've talked to 3 different companies about MFA. Here's the information we've gathered about them. We've done an assessment as to which one we think is the best. Now we're talking to those people. Okay, now, you know, a couple of days later or weeks later, we're doing the installation. Those are milestones that you would want to have. Capturing all this information means that you're showing an auditor what you have seen as issues or what you still see as issues and how you are going to address them. So it's a really pivotal part of 2.0 that wasn't really smiled on, if you will, in 1.0. So I'm really glad that they've shifted because nobody is perfect right out the gate. So I think it's an excellent way for you to manage all of those different items and those gaps that you have to be able to address them and get to full compliance.
Yeah, well said. We have 2 more here, and let's just kind of go through them in relatively short order. We have the security and communications protection. Ryan, do you want to start off the conversation on that?
Sure. This is actually an example of documentation that you inherit from a technology provider or vendor. So FIPS validation certificates are an actual document or supporting security certificate that will often come with a FIPS validation certificate number. And it tells you something about what's required to actually set up the environment to match the as tested configuration. So a lot of organizations don't know that just because they bought, let's say, a piece of network equipment that's FIPS validated, that doesn't mean when you turn it on, it's actually in that as tested configuration running the way it's supposed to. So these documents will tell you what's required as far as additional setup. And then that also allows you to show the assessor that this is what you're acting against. This sort of underpins your baseline configuration.
And Noel, you want to just jump in and tell people what they're looking at in this picture?
So this is actually PreVeil's real certification. This is just a screenshot from the NIST CSRC, which is the Computer Security Resource Center, and captures all that information. So I mean, any person or any product or any solution that you're looking at, if they're saying they're FIPS validated, they should have exactly what you're looking at.
Right. All right, Noel, why don't you just finish it off here and tell us a little bit about system and information integrity and talking about security alerts and advisories.
Sure. This is one that I think is overlooked a lot too. I know that when I first dived into CMMC, this is when I sort of just like put on the back burner, like, oh, you know, I'll deal with this later, but it is a really important one. So having those emails or newsletters, and an example here is the DIB. The DIB does, the CSC, which is, the DC3, there we go. DC3 actually comes out with these every quarter, and it does a basic overview of different cyber threats, reviews them. You can actually sign up for emails with them too, where they will email you threats as they happen. There's a lot of different agencies like that. There's a lot of independent IT security organizations like that. The idea here is that you want to make sure that you're not just living in a bubble, that you're getting information from external sources, trusted external sources, about different security alerts or vulnerabilities or issues that could be happening. So it's with the hope that you can have a more secure network because you're having information from multiple places and not just from, one or two or something internal.
Right. I mean, this has been great, guys. You guys gave a great introduction here to kind of the types of forms and evidence you'll need to have for each of the controls. I think the one thing that this all raises is the best practices for managing the documentation, and how do you test that you have the right documentation. Ryan, so let me just stop these slides and turn off the share. Why don't you perhaps talk a moment about how do you pressure test? How do you ensure the quality assurance of your forms and documentation?
Sure. So this is me coming at this from the perspective of an assessor. So if I want to understand how well the documentation that I've created fits in the context of what assessors are looking at, one of the ways that I can look at that is to take the assessment guide itself, the CMMC assessment guide. And when I look under each practice for that list of examinable objects, you're going to get all these different document types. You know, it might be calling out training records. It might be calling out procedures addressing account management. It might be calling out system settings and associated configuration documentation or something like that. When the document that I'm holding looks like a match for one of those objects for where I think it contributes in the model, that's a good sign, right? It means that I've got a document that is represented in that list, which means it's probably not a far-fetched idea that the assessor would look at that and say, that's relevant to this particular practice. So I think just going through and matching your documents with specific objects in those lists is a really valuable exercise to validate that you're in the right vector for what you should have for the assessor.
And Noel, you know, can you talk about the kind of the responsibility around that for who owns the documentation?
Yeah, that's a really big one. I mean, it's all well and good to have documentation, and I mean, obviously we all need to have it for assessments, but you need to make sure that you have someone who can be that point of contact or that person who's responsible for updating that information. It needs to be updated periodically, usually annually is what people do, but who's going to be responsible for doing that updating? If that person leaves, who's going to take over? If that person is not around for a couple weeks because they're on vacation, who's going to be responsible? It's
never take vacation. That's the answer there.
Never take vacation, just stay at work forever. But you want to make sure also where it lives, what is the location? Do all the people, the stakeholders that need to know where it lives, if it's on an FTP of some kind, or if it's on someone's computer, or it's, in the cloud or what have you, where is it located? Who has access to that? How do you decide who has access to that? What is the need to know? What are those standards for need to know to be able to do that? So there's a lot of different responsibilities you need to kind of think about surrounding all of the different types of documentation. So it's not just making it, it's also making sure that someone can maintain it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings up an important point here. One of making sure that there's oversight and that who's responsible for everything, but it still kind of boils down to getting started with all of this documentation. Do you want to maybe talk, Noel, go on to the next step and say, where can people get started on this documentation? Are there should they immediately call an MSP? Should they go look for documents on their own? What are a couple of the ways to think about this?
Well, I think that probably the best thing is to do a sort of self-assessment and be really honest. Where are we right now? And if it's not that great, that's okay. A lot of people are really just starting from scratch. And if, let's say that you don't have any sort of templates right now, you don't have any sort of documentation, you don't even know what an SSP is, and that's okay. There are templates out there from a lot of different sources. We at PreVeil offer templates. We have a very robust template package actually with SSPs and policy documentation, and also a POAM template as well, which makes things a little bit easier, just sort of takes the edge off, if you will, of a lot of this stuff. And I think it's probably, I definitely think it's the best way to go. I would not start from scratch. I really wouldn't. I think that that's very arduous, and it's just going to take up so much time and effort. It makes more sense to go ahead and buy a template or find a template that you think is really worthwhile, and it's going to make things a lot easier.
And then, hire someone who's highly skilled, like Ryan, to really help you kind of configure those templates to your own space. And in the end, you can save a lot of money. I mean, what do you say to that, Ryan? How should people perhaps get started?
I think that having a starting point that is well structured and sort of exhibits the logic behind why something would be built that way, it immediately shows someone, okay, this is how I could be thinking about documentation. So if you do reach into a set of templates or something like that, what it's going to do is it's probably going to have a more consistent structure that you don't have to sort of like iterate on. And that's going to free you up to do more customization. And so the goal of buying a template or downloading a template is not to not have to do policy and procedure and documentation work. the goal is to free up your cognitive cycles to customize that documentation to match your intent and your reality. And so organizations who could just kind of leave the documents as is when they get some sets of templates and things like that, they're not actually going to be taking ownership of the ideas that are inside it. So it's what you do after you get the templates that is the important step.
You have any template horror stories to share, Ryan?
Oh, I mean, you know, organizations who go grab like a free template from like one of the Department of Energy sites or the DHS sites or something like that, and it's like the Department of Housing like HUD review board is still listed as a responsible party in their final documents that they give an assessor or something like that. You know, things where
they might have trouble passing muster
a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, artifacts that show you that that this wasn't yours to begin with. So then it raises questions in the minds of the assessor on how much of it is true and how much of it is just sort of cribbed from another source. So the more it really feels like your own and that you've internalized it, that's what you want.
I think that's so perfect that you said that too, because it's not about buying a template and then I'm done. It's about buying a template and then making it the habit of every person in the organization, making it something that's internalized, everybody understands it. And like you said, where it's actually owned by your organization. Yeah, it started as a template, but by the time you're done customizing it, you should own all of the information that's within it. I think that's such a big point, and that's true about every piece of documentation, whether or not you have a template or not. You need to own those processes, own those procedures, own that policy, because if you don't, an auditor is going to pick up on it really, really fast.
Yep. Well said. So you guys have a huge fan club. I'm going to turn on over to Q&A now. You know, lots of questions piling up here, and I'm going to just go through them. I don't know if it makes, if we're going to have it clear who this goes to, but maybe we'll just pair off. All right.
Sure.
So let's take this first one. It says matching what my document says to the assessor document says it's not supposed to be hard. Do they not actually have to assess the execution of those things? Say what you do is pretty easy to get done. Do what you say, improve it are a lot tougher. Brian, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that, you know, if your documentation doesn't match the things you do consistently, then that won't pass the smell test when the assessor chooses to do a limited spot check, or when they stage some sort of practical demonstration or something like that. And as we go further into this timeline, assessors are going to become better at selecting the most common assessment procedures and tests that really show whether something is real or true or not. So when I have written down that I pay attention to security advisories, and then I, as the assessor, say, oh, like which ones, how often, and I tell you these and this often, and I pick something from 3 months ago and say, hey, how did you respond to that Conti ransomware advisory, specifically like these items? Like what decisions did you make around that? And I don't have an answer for that. Like that's not going to go well for you.
That's
so,
not going to look good.
Yeah, that's where there's a validation cycle that you need to go through, where you actually take a hard look at what you have written down and say, did I actually do that? Is that true for me?
All right, this next one I'm going to give to you, Noel. It says, do you need to document all 320 assessment objectives to be compliant with NIST 800-171?
Yeah, this question has been floating around since the beginning of CMMC. So Ryan, I'll definitely want to hear your opinion on this as well. But I do not think you have to specifically document and write out all 320. Now, that being said, a lot of those objectives are sort of baked into whatever policy you would create. You know, any person who's going to make a reasonable incident response handling is going to address all the objectives that are already in there just by making it. So it's not, I don't think you have to sit there and say, okay, procedure 1, I'm addressing this objective, you know, here under 3.4.12 or whatever it is. You know, I think it's more baked into everything that you're doing, and it's an understanding to keep that in your mind as you're creating these solutions to make sure that if an auditor does need to go down and check those boxes, those things are in there. But I don't think you have to specifically call out all 320 and document all of them. But Ryan, I would love to hear your opinion on that too.
I think we're of the same mind. There's over 100 assessment objectives that I would classify as a governance objective.
Right.
They're using language that's non-functional, like identify, define, specify.
Right.
Great candidates for documentation. You get into the rest of the model, however, 215 odd required, as objectives, and they're more performance oriented, right? They're using language like enforce, monitor, review, things like that. You may generate documentation in the performance of that, or it may be something that is a little more intuitive. At the end of the day, something has to represent that objective to be satisfied. So whether it's an interview that shows that clearly you know what you're doing and you do it and you can speak to it intelligently and confidently, or it's a practical demonstration, hey, I could have written all this down, but why don't I just show you how our badge access system works on our IT closet? Whatever that is, that's going to be the best way to do it. So I don't think you need 100% documentation, but like I said before, the assessor needs 100% documentation. So where does documentation meet both stakeholders' needs?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Exactly, because the assessor is going to have to document something. So is it in an interview? Is it in a document that I've reviewed? Is it you're doing a test of the system and I can see it? Or like you said, I'm watching the procedure happen in real time. It's definitely, yeah. So I think that's a really good way of saying it, is that yes, you just want to make sure that that assessor can check that box in some way, however that works.
All right, let me go to this next question from Jack. Jack is wondering, does the training need to specify the topic that is covered as well?
Yeah, I would say so. I can't think of a time when a training you wouldn't want to cover the topic. You definitely want to make sure that, and you keep track of that topic. Okay, this is the, if it's insider threat training, then, that's the topic of the training and it needs to focus on that. Again, if an assessor looks at it and you say, I do insider threat training on such and such a day with this much frequency or what have you, they're going to want to know, like we talked about earlier, if they have an interview with someone who took that training and they don't know what the training was about, they can't even tell you what the topic is. That's going to be a definite red flag for the assessor.
Right. All right. People are wondering if we're going to send out the slide deck. Yes, we will. Okay, this one from Ronald. What are the CMMC assessment documentation requirements? Well, I mean,
Ryan should take that one.
Well, again, assessment documentation requirements might mean different things at different stages of being assessed, but we know that at least according to current plans, you are going to use something called your own self-assessment and provide that to the C3PAOs so that they can develop the overall assessment scope and things like that. So one of the things that I preach constantly is that you win or lose all of your assessment battles in scoping. And so my goal when I'm preparing for an assessment is that everything an assessor would need to pass or fail me is in my self-assessment. And I know that that is a very front-loaded burden, and as people's timelines start to stretch on this, that might not always be the choices you get to make. But what I mean by that is that if I don't know how I would expect to be passed by reviewing my own self-assessment, even if it's just a description of how I assessed myself in the past, I don't know how I would be able to predict an assessor arriving at a similar conclusion. And so in a lot of ways, I want my self-assessment package, or whatever we're going to end up calling it, to be the most comprehensive document I've ever put together to represent my compliance. So that's a tall order, but we can start staging and building that now, taking excerpts out of our policies or samples of our procedures or an audit proof that came out of our own internal review, and sort of packaging those into an overall assessment playbook that really is the full width and breadth of what an assessor would need.
Right. Okay, let me go to this next one. I think we answered this, but I'll just say it live so that we can bring it up. Is that I was told there should be artifacts to prove that the trainings actually happened. Agreed?
Yes.
I think we talked about this when we were going through the slides. Yes, you do need artifacts to prove that the training actually happened. Noel, do you want to just jump in and provide an example of what some of those artifacts could be?
Sure. So, I mean, a really easy one is having a training calendar, here are when the trainings took place. And then afterwards, after the training happens, making sure to fill out that log saying, okay, training X happened on the day. An assessor can then look at the calendar and look at your log and say, oh, this happened on the day it was planned to happen. And then again, follow up with having interviews with those people who attended the training, who can then say, yes, I attest that it happened on this day. So yeah, you absolutely definitely want to make sure that you have documentation and again, those interviews where everybody can support that as well.
Right. Ryan, here's another one for you as we're going through these. What is required to ensure that CMMC assessment documentation is compliant with evidence regulations in the event documents are required for legal reasons?
So I am not an attorney, and
Nor do you play one on TV.
well, again, sometimes it's hard to understand what someone means when they say legal reasons or things like that. I do think that there is such a concept as liability when you make claims in a document and say you're doing things that then you're not doing. So I guess from that perspective, I do see a lot of organizations create internal documentation, and then there is a differentiated version that might be used as a proxy document to give more high-level detail to external organizations. So that reduces the liability of the information you're choosing to share with an outside party. I'm not sure exactly what the line of questioning is.
Yeah, I'm wondering if they're talking about False Claims Act or something along those lines. It's a little unclear.
Yeah, if we look at recent False Claims Act investigations or settlements or things like that, when people really seem to become animated about this is when management asks people involved in the program to make claims that are blatantly not true to return to a customer. And the person says, no, thank you. There's things on that paper that are blatantly not true, and I am not going to attach my name to it. So right. That's usually what gets people fired up over FCA discussions.
Noel, why don't we throw this one your way? Are vulnerability scans part of the CMMC assessment?
I mean, I feel like definitely. Yeah. I mean,
talk about this.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I think we've kind of hit that one. But yeah, definitely. Yeah. You want to make sure that you have those vulnerability scans and however it is that you address that, but definitely you want to have them.
And just to be clear, in case there's a different angle,
yes,
the CMMC assessors or the C3PAOs may not run a vulnerability scan like on their own of your systems.
Right.
Like we don't know that. Again, this is something.
That's a good point. It's a very good point. Yeah, it's a very good point. Yes, they will not be doing them for you. When I say yes, they are a part of it, I mean you should be doing them, as a part of your assessment for you, not like the assessor comes in and does one of your system. Yeah, that's a good point.
And this is the importance of determining and negotiating the scope of your assessment where you get a contract with the C3PAO.
Right, exactly.
All right, here's actually an interesting one. So Vicky says, we are working on policies right now. Nobody but IT seems to want to review the documents. Who should review docs other than the FSO and SA/ISSM? So the FSO stands for?
Facility Security Officer.
And SA/ISSM?
Oh, that one I don't remember as well.
Your authorizing official, it's an agency term, so it's maybe not as widely used in private sector.
I'm gonna say I don't think I've had to use that term.
Well, so which of you would like to take a shot at this?
I mean, Ryan, I'm happy to let you take a stab, and I can throw stuff in there wherever we need to. So
the problem is that documentation and policies are being created, and management says that's over there. That's not really our purview. We're not gonna review these or sign off on these. I think that when we look at the disconnect between these policies that are being sort of cordoned off within the IT department and the broad-based nature of what's in CMMC, things like physical security, personnel security, management approval, things like that, I don't think you can contain the entirety of CMMC to just the IT department. And so when I go into conversations with organizations who only want to have IT team conversations, we always have to expand that because somebody else is signing off on those government contracts and it's not the IT teams.
Right.
Somebody else is probably making attestations on your insurance policies. It's not necessarily the IT teams.
I
Different.
think that really kind of reframes the conversation when you say whose tush is on the line if something starts heading south. The conversation suddenly starts to expand, and I think maybe people who are higher in the administration ladder will begin to realize the importance of becoming having a seat at the table.
Yeah, when we see like the CMMC PMO's office talk about the fact that they want to get to a point where annual certifications are being made in SPRS by a senior official in the organization to sort of like own that these self-assessments are true, we know we're shifting towards more direct responsibility in the boardroom. So we might as well get ahead of that.
I think that's a really good point. So to talk to this question specifically and to piggyback on what you said, yeah, I mean, policy documentation should not be limited to IT and the NFSO. I mean, that's great that they're going to be involved. Obviously, they have to be, but you know, HR needs to look at this. If there's anybody in you have physical security people, they need to look at those sections, and definitely you want to get those policies and procedures signed off on and reviewed by your executive management, whatever that is, your CEO, your CFO, whoever it happens to be. But yeah, if there's not buy-in at that higher level, absolutely, you're going to have a lot bigger problems down the road.
Right. And, you know, I realize that we're just about at the top of the hour. Unfortunately, there are, you know, we could go on with these questions for probably the next hour. And, you know, I'll try and see if we can't get some of them answered and send the answers off to the people who asked them, because, you know, there's some really important ones here that kind of highlight how great it is that you guys had a conversation on this. People are really interested in knowing more about what you said. I would be remiss if I didn't end today's webinar by just thanking my wonderful guests. First, my friend and colleague, Noel Vestal, always great to be on the horn with you. And to Ryan Bonner, who has very graciously shared his wisdom and time with us. It is a sincere pleasure to have you join us today, Ryan.
It was great. I had a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Again, for the second, if not third time, this webinar is being recorded, and you will get a link to it by email tomorrow. It will also be on our YouTube page, where all of our webinars are stored and saved. So subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll find all of our webinars there, as well as all of our shows. Until next time, thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.